Hello everyone, today we talk about Pictish cavalry, right? So we address actually for the first time this people, this Celtic speaking people of the Picts, the origins of which actually we're not going to discuss broadly, but they were essentially considered the descendants of the Caledonians and still also partly mixed with the Britons, with the Scots that eventually would take them over in fact in the 9th century. And in fact it's a very long history, right? We don't even know properly who the Picts were in this regard. The video is not aimed at answering the question, but in general we talk about this Picts, often mentioned as the painted people, sometimes improperly so, because in Latin that means painted, right? So the Picts, the painted, the Picti, the painted people, but the etymology actually seems to be slightly different. It could actually identify the type of boats that they used to raid actually the Roman British coasts at the time, and they appear at the end of the third, basically the beginning of the 4th century, as this confederacy of tribes which gained control of what today is fundamentally northern Scotland. In absorbing, in fact, what had remained of the Caledonians. And we know from this so you understand here the timeline is quite extended. We go from the 3rd to the 9th century today. The amount of evidence, of information, is not astonishing high, but for the times and places, actually, there are pretty interesting things that we know. So all we know from about the early times of them comes from the literary sources, and the fact that they raided extensively into Roman Britain, right, at times cooperating in a large-scale invasions with such other nations as the Saxons, the Scots from Ireland, and also the enigmatic Attecotti that nobody actually knows where they came from. They may have been actually Scandinavians, right, sort of Vikings ante litteram, coming in late Roman times, raiding the British and Gallic coasts, right? And this is their first characterization, right? That they might have come substantially, prevalently, let's say, by sea, which may be considered in turn a complement to the Roman land defenses, such as the Hadrian's Wall, but there may have been actually a natural preference to it, considered that the Scots did it, these other peoples from Germany and Scandinavia did it, so why not also the Scots in that specific time? But definitely the Roman presence up to the early 5th century, and then the Romano-Britonic state, we call it in this way. It's a big word, but it kind of went on for a while. These are actually wildly underdocumented periods in history. We don't understand an enormous much. And today we concentrate on their cavalry, given that the random topic choice fell on this specific type of trooper, which actually tells a lot about Pictish society as such. First of all, the British Isles and Ireland have not ever been particularly famous in ancient times for cavalry in the first place. We know there were local horse breeds, of course, and they were used for war. The Britons had cavalry. They had chariots, right? This was normal in this broader northern European area, which had still to develop effective bulks of infantry to counter, to dismiss definitely the chariot war. The chariot that had, however, already followed the transformations that would eventually bring to this appearance also in continental Europe. That is, it got larger and stronger. The Picts did use chariots. We don't have, I think, any direct evidence of it, but definitely we know. It's kind of ironic that in a certain measure we know let's say relatively few about the Picts themselves, and yet the fewer evidence that we have is somewhat more precise relatively to certain aspects of their warfare. in order to understand the Picts, we have to understand their neighboring populations. Thinking about the Gaels, for example, that also talk about the Picts themselves, and that make this people of northern and eastern Scotland essentially fitting in the in this broader Celtic warfare, right? Independently from whether they were actually fully, let's say, fully doesn't exist genetically speaking, but that they were properly Indo-Europeans, right? Pictish is considered, as far as I know, a branch of the Celtic languages, but that's language. What I'm saying is that actually doesn't matter, right? These peoples fought basically in the same ways, right? They shared basically the same ethical codes, the same tactical means, yet they somewhat differed, right? The history of Scotland, what would become actually Scotland after the Picts, in fact, were taken over by the Scots from Ireland, is this greater social stratification than places like Ireland, right? Very different from the south of Britain, where naturally, already from pre-Roman times, kind of a more dynamic and articulated society had taken place. It was they were wealthier on average. They were connected with the other with the European trade circuits. Then the Romans came, that began to build cities, and then the Anglo-Saxons also essentially developed on those bases that had been transformed. Like there had been a decay, generally speaking, but we can say that if you look at medieval history, it's quite evident in early medieval times that the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were somewhat more developed than the ones of the north. These were essentially more unstable systems from a political, military point of view. We have this chronicle about the list of the Pictish kings, right? And partly it's partly historical, partly mythical, let's say legendary, and naturally we should look at this land as essentially made up of several smaller kingdoms that were sometimes, one came to prominence every once in a while, but it was this continuing, switching and of allegiances and of alliances and wars, etc. A bit like actually in the south of Britain, if you look at the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms weren't radically different from that, and indeed there is much in common that the Picts had, even with these populations in some measure, because the north of what would be today's England has always been a kind of a frontier area in some way. The Picts, as we've seen, were conflicting first with the Romans. Then they had even the Romano-Britons, invading them in part, and everything gets blurred. Of course, we think about the mess here: Celts, Romans. Let's put it: Britons, Romans, Scots, Caledonians, then Picts, which we don't understand in this sense clearly, at least, but we know more or less what we're talking about. Then the Anglo-Saxons. Then Scandinavians later. All this melange that actually conferred, first of all, in general, to the British Isles, a very interesting outlook, let's say, but also that brings to serious question how much can we categorically distinguish in this regard. That's often what I say when I make these videos dedicated to a single element. A single type of trooper, let's say. How different do you think that these troopers could be, really? And as from all the evidence that we have, we realize that the Picts in fact shared basically the same ethical vows, militarily speaking, than the Scots, right? Then the Gaels, etc. But what is fascinating in Scotland, and I don't know why, for this reason, actually we should dig more into it, but there was an earlier and kind of more stable government, after all, for those time standards, than places like Ireland, right? That are even better documented by certain standards. And this is evidenced by what? Well, essentially by observing cavalry, right? And this is why we make a video about this, because if you look at Pictish cavalrymen, you realize that they were somewhat the most advanced in Britain for quite a time, right? And not only, right? If you look at even an Irish warfare that we somewhat discussed already, and we'll have to come back on at some point, you realize that cavalry was quite scarce. Right? There were actually a lot of prejudices in this sense by saying, peoples like the Anglo-Saxons or the Gaels didn't quite, at least traditionally, use cavalry. This is not a very good point, in my opinion, even if there are actual sources stating that, right? But you have to contextualize those sources and observe that, as far as we know, actually, these peoples made use of cavalry, also on a much more regular base than is often believed. But if you look at Scotland, and this point, of course, I'm talking about geographically modern-day Scotland to make it easier. So look at Pictland, let's say, better then. Objectively, it was a sound, body of cavalrymen composed by the clanic aristocracy, right? And this shows a greater social stratification. I mean, it's not that Pictland was particularly wealthier than places like Ireland or certain areas of the Midlands, etc., but evidently their political and social organization had brought to this higher certification, hierarchization, in which cavalry figured definitely more prominently than other places, right? And you can't even say, it's because it's a matter of territory, right? Because northern and eastern Scotland are not that plain, right? People say, well, in Ireland there wasn't much of cavalry because the island was covered with forests. Really, right? Even if that was a factor, of course, it may be important, but that doesn't tell it all. I mean, it doesn't explain why a political, social body is going to produce a certain military system, right? Just because of the territory. That is a factor, but it's not the only aspect of it. That's why I say I should look a bit more in it. And the Picts also have, in this sense, probably collected the Caledonian legacy in this regard, because even in previous times, actually in Britain, the only cavalry of some substantial value that is mentioned by classical sources is effectively the Caledonian one, right? And this already speaks for a sort of greater certification at the time that survived in Pictish times. However, how did this differ actually from the rest of British, or also more broadly meant Celtic society, right? Because we have observed that in other videos, that the Celts especially were very fond of horses, especially the Gauls, right? There was a consistent part in Celtic spirituality. It was far from homogeneous actually, but that was present a bit in all of the Indo-European peoples, of this kind of calls of horse riding, warlike deities, right? To which that evidently were sometimes this happens even among the Germans, other peoples that didn't actually have a greatly developed cavalry back in the day, but that evidently as a Caucasian legacy from the steppes had somewhat survived, right? And the same Greeks or same Romans actually had this kind of equestrian ideals themselves, right? The primarily military unit in the early medieval Celtic society was the band of mounted warriors who served the king, right? Early medieval times actually see the rise of mounted warfare a bit all over Eurasia, right? And the Mediterranean places, even like North Africa, like Arabia, because objectively this put in motion, it happened during the migration era, all this instability had somewhat developed, not necessarily the cavalry function, but somewhat increased a bit the military quality of certain peoples, right? Think about what it takes to leave, even in the motivation of leaving Scotland or Ireland or Scandinavia by boat, right, to go raiding on the Roman coasts, right? It can be naturally a valid it can be just maybe you're forced from home, or because of the local situation, or because you simply see that there is possibility of looting across sea. But the point is that this stimulates the intelligence, the rationality, if you want, of peoples that up to that time had remained largely without much of a even a threat. Think of Ireland. This is often said because of Ireland, saying as if before the Viking era and the development of the Berno-Norse society, Irish warfare was largely stagnating. Is it true? Well, yeah, by approximation, we can't say that. I mean, the methods of studies pushes you to be more effective, to be better organized, right? It's not a matter of being more furious or individually skilled, right? That is what these tribal societies are in a nutshell, and that bring literally every single warrior theoretically to know how to ride a horse, fight on horseback, etc. But if you really have to wage war in an orderly fashion, which these people actually were somewhat capable of, right? Nothing of, I don't know, the Roman standards, but it's also a myth that these were just scattered band of indisciplined warriors that didn't even know how to fight information. This is absolutely wrong, right? It was actually, we have proof for the Picts, especially of much more than that. And something that is also probably more fascinating, we'll have to deal more specifically when talking about Pictish tactics as a whole, but of a more orderly and structured. Even the military, even the means of recruitment seems to have been fairly sophisticated. I mean, all these various clans summoned by the kings to go fighting, I mean, that had developed in a functional way, right? And most of society actually revolved naturally around this stuff. We will see it a bit later. But, for example, when Caesar, back in the day, called these military retinues on horseback equites, right, in the Celtic world, and in Wales, this retinue, this family, let's call it in this way, were called teulu, right? Ireland had several such fraternities. Like, these were not just clanic associations. These were really, like, think about the Fiannas, right? That they're different from the clans proper. There were clans that formed this kind of retinues by themselves, but there were also bands of mercenaries that went around, that served these kings, and that were voted to the leader and the deity of war as such. And they lived. We made a video on Gaelic warriors of the same age that speaks actually for the Picts in a certain sense. We also mention in there for this very brutal background, that in which the warrior was fundamentally voted to this absolute military warlike existence, right? And that had its raison d'etre as a freeman in that kind of craft, right? It was really violent, it was really brutal, it was really one of the bloodiest realities that we can think of, because as relatively small societies these could be, they were literally always fighting, right? In one or in another. Of course, there were moments of peace, etc., but everything was aimed at the end of the day to unlock the situation, I mean, to expand their boundaries, etc., to constantly rely on the military option on a regular basis, right? There wasn't the full rationalization that war was somewhat just the instrument of politics itself. It was normal for these societies to regard war as a normal part of their political and social life, and everything revolved around. Not that in the other societies it's so different, but at least there were different. There was a sort of secularization in the process. This thing was all one fundamentally with the whole moral system of these populations, and there were many. Therefore, the Picts actually functioned in the same way. This kingly retinues, often on horseback, that provided the bulk of this cavalry that wasn't particularly numerous, nor even particularly heavy or organized compared to other foes they met, especially the Romans, but they were still effective, and they could, of course, defeat them. even the imperial forces, and especially causing this continuous nuisance, right, at the border, the frontiers, constant raids, hit-and-run tactics, and in this scenario, in this frontier warfare, naturally cavalry has its great importance. And this idea of the military fraternity, of the military band, shares common values and these oaths towards the commander and the deity that assume even a sort of totemic character, like the man of the lion, man of the green swords, man of the snow. These are all bands that you can find in Ireland at the time. The Knights of the Calf, or the Knights of the Golden Collar, that is actually the torque that was indicative of status throughout Celtic Europe, right? These fraternities must have existed among the Picts in an equal manner, right? And there are actually certain neck chains have been found with Pictish inscriptions displaying symbols, sometimes of animals, in the same kind of totemic fashion. Totemic maybe is not excessively the best term, because the totem implies a lineage, right? A connection with the animal by, genealogy. That's not necessarily a thing, but still the older tribal concept that essentially calling the on yourself, actually within yourself, the animal spirit, this animal sacred to the gods, etc. Animals like bears, wolves, etc. It would actually possess you, wouldn't let you go, and you would be voted to, right, as literally an animal fury for the rest of your life. And this was a great problem, because even at a social level, this was usually done to actually, expel those sexually mature young males that were hot-headed and violent and needed to essentially vent their moral forces outside of a civilly regulated society, which these societies definitely had, right? So these were the people who formed the military bands, who went around slaughtering, massacring, raping, etc. And that was the normal daily business, right, at the time. And the opportunity was to get hired by kings to increase your status, to create a community on your own sometimes, right? And in this continuous warfare that was already intermittently present in these areas. Like if it wasn't one place, it was another, and therefore you can imagine even the shift of these bands across these territories. I mean, even beyond, of course, the borders of Pictland in Britain, in the rest of Britain, and in Ireland, right? And we know about the fluidity of these movements, especially from the side of the bands proper, right? And it's also interesting that some of these artifacts, these neck chains, have been found outside Pictish areas, right? Which is actually not a great news for those who own them, in the sense, at least for at the time, since it means that probably these were killed on the spot, right? So it witnesses indirectly this famous external raids that the Picts led especially towards the south. Talking about what would like Pictish cavalry look? Well, fundamentally, first of all, let's point this out, that differently from the other British peoples, many Picts are depicted fighting mounted, right? Armed with javelins or spear and carrying round shields, often with spiked bosses, right? And the riders invariably wear a tunic and sometimes leave off their cloaks. And some are depicted even wearing sort of shoes, right? But they were generally bare-legged, in fact. And the picture that the fasces, let's say, of cavalry is not an enormously impressive one, right? It was at the time, actually, cavalry was not the decisive arm right? Infantry was still fundamentally solid. Even the Picts are often, in fact, represented fighting on foot, and they had definitely their own way of fighting, even with impressive weapons that might have been, if not used specifically against cavalry, but that show us a certain degree of tactical sophistication that we stereotypically we don't attribute much to these people. But in my opinion, there is a bit more to say about them. And but I don't know, regular cavalry like the Roman one would have been surely better equipped, better organized, more disciplined, right? And as we've seen, also solid infantry would have stopped a Pictish cavalry. But this cavalry, in fact, must be considered in its own context, which was, by election, the one of scouting, driving off cattle, right? Most of warfare was actually about raiding other people's lands, raising cattle, and essentially getting away with that, hopefully, right? And the thing was a problem, actually, because the territorial control of the Pictish kingdoms wasn't terrific, right? So there was always the problem posed by these various raids that could happen every once in a while, and that also speaks for this, the relative militarization of these societies. And so as we've seen, also their equipment is it's pretty regular one for the time. Lances, slash javelins, right, and circular convex shields, right, averaging something like 18 inches in diameter, with this prominent spiked bosses, which actually suggest a somewhat dynamic fighting style, right? The majority of Pictish cavalry can be considered as fundamentally light, right, and or medium maybe, and it's very rare to find what we probably call heavier cavalry. This belonged chiefly to the chieftains, right? If you saw an armor in Pictish cavalry, that was generally attributable to a king, right? And naturally, I'm pretty sure there were entire units of Pictish cavalry that at some point wore consistent armor for those time standards. We have evidence of padded clothing as well that is actually very effective in many circumstances, and generally speaking on the torso, right? These troops seem to have been bare-legged generally, and a chieftain could have carried a short sword, right, and long-sleeved mail corselet and a helmet with nape guard and nasals, right, and also seemingly typically Pictish were these long bears, right, and needless to say, the Picts could easily have been equipped also with kind of Roman equipment they raided or actually purchased, right, because they weren't always at war with Rome initially, nor with the other peoples that eventually kept using. I mean, think about the Roman legacy, not just among the Romano-Britons, but even among the Anglo-Saxons by a certain standard. These were the areas where there were more, metal armor, etc. And the elites, especially, would get it. We have actually fragments of Spangenhelm in I don't remember which Pictish find. And therefore, there's nothing strange, even if you think about the typical Sutton Hoo helmet, this menacing Anglo-Saxon mask, right? And that might have easily been seen in places like Sweden. We think that specific find might also be related to in Anglo-Saxon Britain. In Scotland, why not? Even in Ireland, as far as we're concerned. I mean, we don't have to be dogmatic about it. The general impression is, the more towards the Celtic fringe you go in the British Isles, and the least troops are armored, right? But already here, if you look at Pictland and you look at Ireland, generally speaking, you see that Pictland has more elite. As we were saying before, its society is more stratified, and therefore you have people that in the first place fight on horseback, which among the Gaelic armies is fairly rare to see, or at least is rarer compared to the Picts, right? And this went on in the same way. The Scottish clans were somewhat more, more stable than the Irish one, and more affluent in some way. These clienterly societies were also, somewhat feudal in mindset, right? The idea that there was a nobility that somewhat was distinguished by the rest of the freemen, that controlled the societies, that exchanged favors, that naturally saw themselves as a reference point within this world, right? And that also received the same amount of training. We actually have plenty of information, especially from Ireland, of what these kind of adoptive fashion, for example, sending your children to be trained in the household of a powerful king, and becoming, naturally politically attached to that person, and sharing the benefits, and this king would distribute even weapons and loot to these people, and it was all a clienterly society functioning like that. And during this process, the aristocracy was educated, right, to the arts of war, and other political skills were games, even like they were very resembling of ancient Celtic or Germanic origins, like this running among the spears, this proofs of agility. There's all a list of this stuff, at least documented for the Giles. Even chess to keep the mind open, and that's quite close actually to what the ideally, right here there is no teleological connection, but the knight more than the warrior would actually become. And the fact that these troopers here in Pictland are actually on horseback, right, is quite meaningful in that regard, because there is all an equestrian ideal of nobility that gets continuously reinforced, right? In the Irish tale, the destruction of the Derga's hostel, is described the equipment of Pictish champions that included, quote, 3 black huge swords they had, and 3 black shields they bore, with 3 dark broad green javelins above them. Thick as the spit of a cauldron was the shaft of each, right? These tales are all kind of this exaggerated, but they're emphasizing, in fact, here very much the individualism. I mean the physical strength, the individual prowess of ideally this was still ideally a heroic society, right? It was now relatively far from it, because Britain actually in the Celtic world was the last place where heroic warfare, or at least what it practically was, survived the longest. But after 400 years of Roman domination, a lot of things have changed, and also these populations have somewhat evolved, right? For example, about the same name of the Picts, the devoted warriors, like they were covered in tattoos, etc. There is actually evidence for the early Pictish period from Christian sources. Were also kind of blaming these practices and these bonds of brotherhood with these alliances were forged by drinking each other's blood and voting to be voted to death. That's how the Irish monks put it, and that's quite actually insightful. It's quite intelligent in that regard, because it really tells you what this thing was in the end, because there was also this dark, tragic sense of the destiny of the world and of the heroes that were somewhat doomed to die by vocation, right, as they were warriors. And that's what happens to warriors if you insist on being one. And this list for the destruction of the Derga's hostel is very fascinating, because here it shows you fundamentally this this equipment. There's not of an individual warrior, right? These are champions proper, which means they're fundamentally aristocrats, that they're elite of society. They have as far as I understand, yeah, 3 swords each, 3 black shields, right? 3 broad green javelins, right? And this is very interesting because it shows you how even this warfare had remained substantially dynamic, right? A point that is often done about Pictish warfare was very quick, very agile, that since there was a very few armor, this is valid for the Gauls as well. It was fundamentally hit-and-run tactics, very few melee. This is not entirely true, and especially for the Picts, this does not seem to have entirely true. They had remarkable stopping infantries, and they even had this heavier. Think about the Picts display these double-hand axes that are somewhat typical of Scotland, also in later times. That exists since, in fact, these years, and that are evidently for not just for a champion use, but it was somewhat maybe a functional weapon together with so-called pikes that are displayed in with the Pictish stones that are, as we will see now, one of the best evidence, not just from early medieval Scotland, from early medieval Europe, because they tell us an astonishing amount of information which you don't find for the rest of Britain, for example, or Ireland. And that's why you see actually why do we have them? Because probably being society being more stratified in that regard produced these higher forms of representation that survived, right, into a kind of a more framed political and social culture, and that represent a segmentation of this society with all the various ranks of troops, the horsemen, the infantrymen, and so on. But so that a champion could still fight, for example, also with javelins that are, I mean, halfway what I mean, it's not that the nobleman wouldn't use a javelin, right? But this is still not, I mean, this has not become the knight still that would become in later times, where they'd still use javelins, but preferably they would fight more with this kind of shock force, right? This is still at a more individual level, and even the idea of dueling, of champions dueling, and this kind of this prolonged fight with spare weapons, etc., that with attendants that are represented actually also among next to the Pictish nobility during hunting. We will see it now. Really make you see how central was still the individual, the military, the warlike individualism of these people, and especially within the elites. But this is not necessarily true among actually the middle classes, that might have been actually more orderly, less ferocious than what also stereotypically the sources tend to say sometimes. So there is also another element that can be of interest, is that the Picts initially in this early phase, when essentially of Roman Britain still began this sort of expansion that is witnessed by these large stone towers called brochs, as far as I don't know if I pronounce it correctly, and they in the Orkneys that there is an especially large number of signs, and it's believed that it actually spread southwards from there. This is kind of very, very fascinating. And it's also kind of weird because I think the Orkney sites are usually they're not, I mean, inserted among the other Pictish finds, right, sites as such. I mean, but this is another story. The point, though, I'm making is that there is a moment in which the Picts felt the need for the protection of very strong fortifications, right? So in a society that was evidently not that particularly devoid of, at least of pious intent, right? Because encapsulation is not necessarily just a reason of defending from the external. It's also having a territorial vision, even in an aggressive function. So this examination of the broadsides shows that the inhabitants also were, however, poor, right, short of metals, in sanitary habits usually, and they had opportunities of acquiring Roman objects by trade or looting. And this is the picture generally, probably, of a military concerned society, right? Because if you build this stuff and there is not evidence of a particularly wealthy situation, after all, with an already particularly affluent aristocracy, where this means that probably those fortifications had a more consistently defensive purpose, after all. But that's also the moment in which the Picts themselves are on the offensive. However, as in fact Pictish control spread, the broch fell out of fashion, right? They stayed in use, but others were actually abandoned in favor of wheel houses, right? So this is a sort of pacification, right, after the major wave of the migration era, of the political instability, etc. There is this idea that you even find the brochs being dismantled, right, with stones used to build houses, right, other structures, and this is definitely the proof of a greater sense of security, right, as especially unfriendly neighbors had been conquered, right. The Picts come to also suppress, enemy presence all around. And that's when the Picts began to carve these stone labs, displaying exceptional artistry. And fortunately for us, right, they, at least for our military interests, they show these slabs showed very often armed warriors, right, especially the later ones. And the typical, that's where we get the typical picture of the Pictish warrior, as such, that he's on foot, actually, and armed with a small square shield and a spear, and a lesser number show archers and horsemen. And this is interesting because also the mention of archery is not excessively spread in those times and places around. And it seems rather that this could correspond to a tactical specialization, functionalization of the troops, like this thing about the carved stone at Aber Lemno. There are these, these representations of an orderly society, of a politically and militarily orderly society, with the horsemen at the top, with the infantry in the middle, and these other specialties that make you see definitely not a rabble of disordered tribesmen, right? This is really something more elevated in some form. And from these stones we can maybe guess something about their tactics, right? And the idea is that there's this center of spearmen, right, that beats off the enemy horsemen using spears, holding both hands under arm, right? And the whole picture in itself tells us two things. First, that that traditional bulk of infantrymen that would remain kind of typical of Scotland also in the later Middle Ages was conceptually already there. Also, these figures with double-handed axes that are still prominent, may come out of the ranks and finish off the fallen horsemen, right? These pikemen are there because they have to stop horses. That's the most evident idea. Or even if it was actually, as it was surely in some measure, used against other infantrymen, it's still an orderly way to conceive battle formation. You don't find the foot just the foot champion followed by these guys. There is cavalry that stands somewhat out of this, right? And the other cavalry is also displayed with as a skirmishing one, right? So the idea is that there was this kind of doubled, this sort of diversification also for the strategic goals of this campaigns. We know that the Picts raided far south, even in Anglo-Saxon territory. That if you do that for pillaging, etc., and looting, you do it mostly like hit and run strategy, right, and tactics, actually. And that is quite fitting, but had actually, as would happen, the Southerners come to tread the same Pict land, well, you also needed sometimes to meet them in open ground, even though it's very likely that already at this time, actually, the Picts were as skilled in, climbing up mountains and taking refuge, making, scorched earth strategy, just like the later islanders, and pretty effectively so, right? And there are, and the mention of archers is also interesting. I mean, this idea of, archers that are displayed, right? This is a big deal. Usually in the rest of, European warfare, you don't find this great attention toward archery, right? And its use somewhat signifies, as we were saying before, probably a certain pride in the accomplishment of a tactical specialization. Albeit archers would probably work better in ambushes. Well, if you have especially these masses of spearmen, you want to disorder them, and for even cavalry trying to break through the weaker parts of the line, why not, right? So there probably was something more advanced than we think in this warfare, and we shouldn't be surprised of it, but also we should bear in mind what was Scotland before this. Like, if you take, I don't know, Tacitus' account of Agricola's battle against the earlier Caledonians at Mons, Gropius, for example, or even, and you consider that Caledonian infantry was mostly about skirmishers, right? There wasn't this infantry, pike infantry, right? Like we see here. That was a massacre, right? The Roman auxiliaries actually handled, disposed of the Caledonians pretty easily, even of their chariots. And there were many, right? The Romans managed to repel them. Consider the 3rd century campaigns of Septimius Severus in Scotland. I mean, those were pretty harsh things. Like, we can't imagine that this massive structural damages that were done by looting, destruction, massacre, because also against these peoples north of the Adrian Wall, there wasn't much you could do with. Like, they didn't want to be Romanized. They couldn't be integrated fundamentally. If you wanted to get rid of them, you had essentially to launch these campaigns in their core land and started literally massacring them. I mean, from a demographic point of view, so that they could receive such heavy structural blows that they wouldn't recover, but in one generation or two, right? And at this point, Scotland is something very different, right? It has a much more unitary political asset, right? These kings really are people who have reshaped, redrawn in many ways local politics and control of the population, and they're more confident of themselves. Probably the Picts affirmated themselves in this sort of moral ransoming from the defeats that had happened in the centuries before against the Romans, right? And being proud of having accomplished something more than their ancestors, having organized their military in actually a more advanced fashion, right? And it's very difficult actually to tell how it really went because we have such scanty evidence. But when you see, for example, on the Pictish stones neatly depicted, and probably that's, as far as I know, in Europe the only iconographic evidence of it, of crossbowmen, because the Picts did have crossbowmen in the early medieval times. Of course, they weren't anything like the low medieval crossbow, but these were essentially like the late Roman manuballista, right? The concept here is these guys had gotten something from that experience. They had remained sheer tribesmen, right? They had brought the thing to the next level. They had began to have to rationalize the benefits that would become from not a merely tribal society. It was this, clanically speaking, really still was, right, with all its load of heroism and pride, etc., but had began to add to it a kind of a more constructive side of the story. And the reason why you don't find probably other pictures of crossbows or even of bowmen so easily in the rest of Europe is that it's a good question, why not? But and it can't be a simplification of it, but let's say, what did a Merovingian commis earned from representing himself, let's say, with a bow, right? We all know they used them, because these guys, if they were not at war, they spent their days hunting. And every single knight in medieval Europe knew how to use a bow pretty damn well, right? But they wouldn't represent themselves as such. Why? There were cultural prejudices against bows. Yes, they still figure in the Germanic epics, in this kind of cunning, sinister, unloyal way, right? The heroes always get killed, even by this way. Think about Achilles, even back in the day. But this is even beyond in the European tradition, right? The idea that the great hero at the end of the day dies in a kind of a stupid way, after all. Think about Siegfried, etc. So we know that that's a kind of the due attention to the fact that these weapons existed and were used at all times, but they were not like to be represented. And also the greatness of always a Carolingian, a Merovingian, let's say, commerce was being already at that time a kind of a consistently well-armored horseman with a sword, right, and not with a bow, right? Why? Right, there were also a lot of other different symbolisms in here that the thing is more anthropologically complicated than it seems. But I think that the Picts coming relatively, out of the blue, but having accomplished this feat of, after all, establishing their dominance over this land, and having even survived the terrible Romans, etc. in Britain, they somewhat took pride of the fact that they had probably gained they had obtained a part of the military legacy of this civilization, right? And consider that this is very important, because they had been competing with the same Romano-Britons in this regard. Not that the Picts ever wanted to be the next Romans, that is not the point, but I mean, I think in Britain, after the depart of the Romans, there was a sort of of claiming who would have had to rule at some point, right? Think about the Anglo-Saxon arrival and all these. The Anglo-Saxons developed immediately an extremely and radically aggressive and imperialistic mindset towards the whole Britain, right? The Anglo-Saxons thought they were there to rule, right? I mean, it didn't happen actually immediately. It was eventually a kind of also monarchic construction of relatively middle and late Anglo-Saxon period, but the idea that they felt to be the best of everybody else, and that those guys they had partly conquered, partly assimilated, let's say, that's also complicated. It was very alive in these people, and that there was this pride, this competition, this sense of who is the next cool one that has to rule in here, because these guys had realized what the Romans had been about. And the fact that these guys represent themselves even in crossbows, right? They were typically, we don't know any Celt whatsoever, any other people aside from the Greeks and the Romans in Europe that made use of crossbows, right? So there was evidently a stigma attached to it in some ways. The other thing, actually, I don't want to get this too far, because the hunting, crossbows are displayed chiefly in hunting scenes. But it's not very difficult to imagine that such a weapon would have found its way also on the battlefield, right? They might have been less handy than bows or even slings that probably were also in use. The sling also has this strange history. It was full of slings in the ancient world, and all of a sudden in the Middle Ages they seem to shrink, but actually they were used at this time in these areas, and we know that, right? Think about the Highlands at this time. You're trying a slingshot from up of a mountain, you smash through everything. So it's a great pride surrounding the way that this people, and we know actually that the Romans had difficulties at countering their raids, right? Usually the Romans waited for this invaders to be burdened by loot, and then so letting them loot expressly sometimes, and then attacking them when they were burdened by loot and re-seizing everything, right? But I mean, the most radical way, I mean, there was no way to stop these, because it happened here and there. They didn't have any unity as such, so it was very complicated to deal with them in the first place. There are lots of other, let's say, elements that suggest the existence of an unquestioned tension of Pictish culture. All these animal symbols, for example, that it's somewhat also difficult to decipher. There are all these, decorations and even standards in a kind of a proto-heraldic way, right? With this free-flowing animal designs, right? That are somewhat strange monsters rather than animals. You don't really understand. As far as I know, there aren't horses, as far as I've seen, but there are certain traditions attached to the Picts. I always think about Epona, the Gallic deity of that warlike equestrian deity that was ferocious in this regard, close to the horse, like a sacred animal. Seemingly, actually, the Celts didn't have this homogeneous religion as we think. There are basically no evidence, if not something very dubious, between Gaul and Ireland for one deity that was actually a shared pantheon. Right, the pantheon didn't belong to these people. They were still somewhat not animistic. However, they had passed through, kind of this quite loosely in this kind of identification of single deities. This is another thing we don't discuss now, but also Christianity had began to make its way. Pictish society had druids, right? They were people who there was actually a sort of initiatic role that wasn't a case as such. There were certain kings that were druids, but just to make an example, many warriors were druids, etc. But we know that they were somewhat open to dialogue with the Christians as well, even if the Christians criticized, however, especially their bloodiest military practices. The Picts were, in fact, represented as headhunting. That's something that is witnessed also for later sources. It was a radical brutality in this warfare that today we don't insist to, but think of these warriors as barely civilized in the sense that we have wanted to show a bit today from a military point of view. I mean, even think about the physicality of these people. I mean, what it means to live in a world like that. And there is an ethos. Like, these guys are imbued with the stories of heroes, of warriors, of physical dual prowess, right? They learned all the special fencing techniques, these parries, etc. In a world that also was, as we've seen, really did commit the individual fighter so much to that first-hand experience, right? To this kind of to the need of learning how to live like that. And the aggressiveness, even the resilience, right? The soil of pain that was probably they were used to living in a very different way from ours. That would have seemed incredible, right? Also, this rugged. Even think about the climate there. It's not that thrilling, right? And that these were tough places to live in, especially in early medieval times. And look at that video I made on the Gaelic warrior of the same time, because what I say there is basically all attributable to the Picts as well, right? Because they were basically the same types of societies, right? And there is this traditional let's say belief that fundamentally among the Picts there were horse whisperers, right? They were practitioners of an ancient craft that is said to have originated with the Picts, or at least in the northeast, right, of Scotland. There is this legend of horse whisperers as the elite of farm workers back in this legendary time, that were that they knew actually several arcane methods to control and manipulate their horses, right? And this slow whispering, mumbling in the horses' ear, in their own language, as they said, right? The horses' language. And the use of body language as well. It was combined with spells, potions, and equine aromatherapy. Was naturally used also for cavalry training. Right. Consider that Pictish warriors would make the societies would on a regular basis would make use of narcotics, of psychedelics, and things that would essentially put them in contact with this ultra mundane dimension, would put these people in contact in turn with the afterlife, the ancestors, the past, the dead heroes. Also in this kind of largely also military context, thinking about the Celtic Dasacht, right? This fury that is equivalent to what was known as the Germanic fury, right? Or we made a video about the Indo-European sacred fury, and this shared some of beliefs that was basically how this people reasoned, in the sense that, once again, if you live in a society where there is a few political military coordination, an individual has to take matters in his own hands, and if you have to go to battle, basically without armor, because we're talking about early medieval Northern Europe, like it's only most depressed areas of the continent. You literally don't have any better, right? At that point, you would kind of vote yourself to this kind of superhuman dimension. This divine. That's why all these connections with the even the animal deities, this kind of mythical world, to get the strength, to get those characteristics that would make you fit for combat. Even the fact that the Picts fought allegedly naked, right? There is evidence up to at least the 5th century of this stuff. Or I don't remember, maybe of the woad, of the painted, of the tattoos, right? But that was all an apotropaic way. I mean, these people believed that naturally those tattoos had for them a special meaning. They weren't even functionalized as we think. Like, these people were often born with a sort of stigma, sort of of destiny, right? They had their animal keen soul, right? And they would essentially develop in that belief. They would create these tattoos to essentially say who they were in front of the deity. And even this fact of fighting naked at that point, it added the kind of a spiritual and material dimension, because spiritually speaking, that is, I show to the world, right, to my enemies. Never forget about the showing to any enemies who you are. This point is an enormous honor, is an enormous pride, right? You fight there for who you are. Right? This is something we have increased. Our societies have largely detached ourselves from the sense of reality in this regard. These people were fully within it. Like we often exchange this as a, madness. That was one of the most concrete realizations out there. Materially speaking, fighting naked, if you don't have any, any armor, or at least you have to fight just with, with cloth. Pieces of cloth can even stick in your wound and get more infected. But at that point, it's better to fight naked, because if you are going to be hit by a blade, right? Unless you have a padded coat, there is already something that in that material context, I don't think it was so cheap, right? It's better if you fight naked, right? And there's also a way to intimidate the enemy and make it nervous, right? We have all of these beautiful knowledge about, for example, the audio dimension of battles, right? This fact that they would start chanting and playing these instruments like horns. There are horns actually depicted on the Pictish stones that are the same that are to be found still in 13th century Scotland, played by these warriors, because that was the same the same tradition, the idea that the horn in that sense is a sacred instrument that owns in itself something magic, right, that re-evokes a certain power coming from a supernatural dimension, and that these people lived all within this mindset, because they had even to exercise in a way the sheer and traumatizing and brutal reality they lived in, because there was no other way to psychologically cope with it. We can't even imagine how brutal this reality was, how violent, how, and that's what would bring them to even invest so many resources in this kind of individual commitment. Because if you don't have anybody who impresses discipline from the top on this society, what happens in battle is you get annihilated. So this had to be beliefs that had to be widespread among the people. And this is typical of tribal societies, right? They don't have a better way of coping with things, so they actually create this moral system for which they kind of address to these problems individually. It's definitely not particularly effective compared to higher forms of, to more developed societies, but it's still better than nothing. And actually all of these emphasis that sources of the kind of relatively more civilized people say, these were barbarians, they fought like animals, etc., that they were ferocious. It's because they were describing what these people needed to be effective, because they were, right? Ask the Romans. I mean, they were harassed continuously by these people. And so, coming back to the horse whisperers, there were even repellent or jading scents, such as dead mole or bracken spores, that could cause a horse to stop dead, for example. Also aromatic drawing oils involving oregano, rosemary, cinnamon, fennel, ginger, in order to neutralize jaders or calm difficult horses, right? Consider that also animals in this regard were seen as individuals, like a horse. Like in these realities, there is not a rational categorization of reality. There is not the horse as a prototype. There is that horse that has a specific role in this world, that has a special connection with the deity, with a certain place, with a certain person, right? If you go to fight on horseback, you can't risk your life riding a beast that you don't have something in sympathy with, right? You must trust each other to the death, and these horses were extremely precious sometimes. So once again, here ideal and material at the same time. Ideal because these people loved these horses. They were their symbol of status, of power. They were, together with their weapons, some of the most important things they had, and materially speaking, because they costed a freaking lot, right? And believe me, it's not so obvious to look at early medieval Northern Europe and seeing a society that revolves so heavily on cavalry. Like if you look at contemporary Scandinavia at the time, there were similar things. I always get kind of triggered when I say that, in that Scandinavian early medieval times, they didn't have a great deal of cavalry, right? Look at how they represented themselves, even as aristocrats. There's always a horse. Think about, look at the sagas. Look at there is always this strong relation between the horse and his owner, the warrior, right? And what would become the knight, ideally speaking. And that has nothing to do with how orderly, how structurally that cavalry is widespread, right? And how that belongs to a corp or something like that, because that's a clanic society. But the point is that the individual warrior is tied to it. So the consequence is that, individually speaking, these were astonishing horsemen. But collectively speaking, if they didn't suck, however, they weren't such a great deal, right? That's always the major deal, collective training, which these guys rarely had. But in all of Britain, in Ireland, these Pictish cavalrymen were effectively some of the best things you could find in front of yourself, and you, believe me, you would have not liked to deal with that situation, right? Because these guys definitely were as murderous, as effective, and fearsome as you can imagine. There were also this means, for example, horse whispers managed to distribute sometimes jailers across the path of enemy cavalry, right? Also from the Pictish stones we get interesting pictures of hunting, right? Imagine this Pictish kings all having their own kind of household, where after the battle the banquet was the most important event. That's where all the the chieftain talked with his retinue, would invited other chieftains, where sometimes they would kill each other, in the best tradition. They would get drunk and so on, and it was naturally a show off, right, to show in this miserable world the greatest amount of wealth in the context. But I don't know what he was saying about this. But another occasion actually was the hunting, right? Another great occasion to show power and also to commit the rest of society is pretty evident. And these Pictish stones show mostly spearmen on horseback, accompanied by horn-blowing servants and packs of hunting dogs, and occasionally women, depicted riding side saddle, right? This is interesting because it, that they hunted red deer, wolves, bears, wild boars, and also the fierce wild cattle of the highlands. That was, also a challenge. And however, there was also some foot hunting, right? And that's where we see, for example, the crossbows. So these aristocrats would essentially live within that mindset. Like even their dogs, they're this kind of idea of hunting. It was all, as you know, hunting is perfectly well. It's just a preparation for war, right? Hunting people or other animals is literally the same thing, right? Hunting humans can be a bit more dangerous, but depending on the situation, maybe sometimes not so much. That's what these guys did all the time. They were raiding entire places, which is, imagine all the terrorized populations trying to escape and to be hunted down. These horsemen, it's disturbingly the same picture here, just with animals, right? With deer and wolves and bears. There are actually also ferocious animals, so this is also interesting. By the way, those Pictish spearmen are sometimes using, this weapons as if, in not much of a different way from which it was used for hunting boars or other. In fact, there were similar weapons after all. We could add something, since we're talking about cavalry, about horse breeds used by the Picts, right? And the most common depicted, especially from the Pictish stones, because that's pretty good evidence, is the small native pony or Highland Garon, right? And this survives today, as far as I understand, as the Eriskay pony, and there is also a larger type of animal, though, that is probably related to the fell pony and to the extinct Galloway heavy horse, right? So these breeds were probably distinguishing also different kind of types of cavalry, or at least different mounts that could be used. It was typical that the heavier horse would be used chiefly for charging and smashing, right? It was slower, but more beefy and kind of smashing through the enemy lines. The lighter ones for running faster, right? Ideal, especially during raiding, warfare, skirmishing, right? And that's what they did, right? We don't know much about tactics. How some say that essentially cavalry would operate chiefly on the flanks of the formation, next to the spearmen, to the phalanx, let's call it in this way. Yeah, it's possible, especially lighter cavalry, possibly, but from certain from certain stones, especially if I'm not wrong, the one of Aberlemno, I think that the preeminence of cavalry that you can see easily at the top, under what appears to be the chieftains or other, powerful figures, is that they could have actually fought in the front, right? If this cavalry, I mean, this is just an hypothesis, right? But the concept is that aside from the fact that every battle is different, there is not a standard formation to be employed, but the concept that even in the heroic fashion, in this kind of increased importance of cavalry on the battlefield, on the Pictish battlefields, over time, that there could be really a clash between horsemen in the first ranks, right? Even though, yeah, it's still possible they would hold in reserve, and but once again, probably there's much more to say about this, because the tactical differentiations here are very, very thought-provoking from the Pictish stones, and could hide a more articulated tactical system than we think, right? Alright, so I think we have said, obviously we could add lots of stuff to this, and we will keep making videos about the Picts. This was just about Pictish cavalry proper, right? I don't think there is much to add in this regard. I mean, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, there is a kind of standard character many times looking at these cavalrymen. I mean, Ireland is said to have had very few cavalry at this point, almost non-existent, but if they had, it was something very, very close to the Picts. Right here, the main difference stands in how that's systemic to the, in which degree it is systemic to society, not because there weren't horsemen, right, in Ireland, let's say, or not even among the Anglo-Saxons. I mean, the idea that the Anglo-Saxons didn't traditionally fight on horseback, according to me, that's nonsense, right? Okay. That's the first evidence, I think, in 1052, because there was the guy coming from Normandy that imported that, allegedly, but actually we have evidence of cavalry being in the middle Anglo-Saxon period, coming on the battle, and then the chieftain, the commander, excuse me, ordering to dismount. So there is enough evidence to actually say a lot of interesting things. And no, yes, definitely the Anglo-Saxons fought on horseback. And there is reason to think also that probably that was more systemically spread than we think. And especially when you have to cope with enemies like the Picts that haven't, right? I mean, you can't think, I mean, it's a mistake, and we are certain about the fact that, of course, that Anglo-Saxon cavalry was used to cope with those enemies, but not just in Northumbria, right? This was literally everywhere, right? Maybe more, yes, in the north because of the raiding of the frontier nature of those lands with Scotland, etc., but not with definitely not being absent or not used just by dismounting at the moment of combat, right? Even though, of course, we must understand that infantry, especially today, we covered a very long time, but at the beginning of this period, especially, infantry is still effectively the bulk of enemy, and it still remains throughout all these centuries. Actually, to the 9th century, there is no proof that these were, that cavalry was the decisive weapon, but it definitely had a great importance, and at least we can see it quite clearly from the Pictish evidence. Anyhow, let's stop it here, and I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.